Hello, and welcome after a very long hiatus. 4 months. I think the last episode on this channel was in September. Can you believe it? So it's been a really long hiatus, but here we are, and we on a very exciting and I think interesting adventure. Although the theme is Vincent's long yellow brick road to painting Starry Night. The question that we're asking in this episode is, why is it important to dream? And although that question needs additional context, I'm going to not give you that context right off the bat. I'll give you definitely sketch out the finer details in a little bit more detail later on. But just for the time being, let it stew in your brain matter, this idea, why is it important to dream? And I want you to think about that in terms of, and I'm not giving you that full context, but think about where Van Gogh was at this time of his life. Mid-January, we're going to go to his letters very soon. Mid-January, he's lost his ear, he's lost his friend, he's lost his house, he's about to be kicked out of all, so he's about to lose all his roots. Everything that he'd hoped to set up in all is basically gone. And what does he have to hold on to? His family are far from him. His dream seems to have been taken from him. So what does he have to hold on at this time, right? And then also in your life, in terms of you, why is it important to dream? And we're going to look at that question from a couple of different dimensions. Okay, good to see all the usual suspects here. Bria in France, Stephanie in Connecticut, Chelsea in Canada, Murphy, I'm not quite sure where you are, Wendy, I wonder if we're going to see the other Stephanie. But anyway, here we are, and Mel Stella, good to see you as well. Okay, so we're going to sort of jump right into the letter, and then I'll provide you guys with a little bit more context as we go on. So we're going to the 9th of January, 1889, and Vincent writes, "My dear Theo, even before receiving this very moment your kind letter, I had had a letter this morning from your fiancé announcing the engagement. So I have already sent her my sincere congratulations in reply, and herewith I repeat them to you. My fear that my indisposition might prevent you from making that very necessary journey, which I had so much and so long hoped for, now that this fear has disappeared, I feel myself quite normal again." So what is he saying here? He's saying, I don't have any fears. So in the context of the engagement, he's saying, my fears has disappeared. I'm not sure what fear he's talking about. It seems to be about a fear about making a journey. And then he says, I feel myself quite normal again. Now, one can interpret that as, is he putting on a brave face? Is he being kind and sweet? Does he actually feel differently about it? Anyway, he goes on to say, this morning I was again at the hospital to get another dressing, and I walked for an hour and a half with the house surgeon. We talked a bit about everything, even about natural history. Does he seem to be depressed? Does he seem to be in the first couple of paragraphs, does he seem to be having trouble expressing himself? Does he really even stay on the topic of his brother's engagement for very long? He basically says, my sincere congratulations, which he's already sent to her. He then says, I'm feeling quite normal. And then the next thing is getting back to the news of what's going on, right? speaking of news and what's going on, I've got a little bit of news for you guys. Today's quite a special day for a couple of reasons. One is it would have been my mother's birthday. My mother's birthday was 3rd February. So just trying to do a calculation. I think she would have been 79 years old this year. She died when she was 44. Um, Today was a kind of unexpectedly good day for me. It was the first day I've gotten on my bike for 3 months around about. If I look a little bit red in the face, it's from catching a bit of sun. And I felt surprisingly strong for not being on a bike for 3 months. So yeah, it's just kind of a special day in a certain way. It's also quite special because the doctor said to me, I don't have any lung damage, I don't have any uh, problems with my lungs or swollen heart or anything like that. Remember, I did cough blood when I had COVID. So yeah, I also want to touch on the similarity of course, what Van Gogh did was far more ambitious and invested far more into it. But the similarity of this idea of a YouTuber who goes to America and instead of just doing your thing, you get very sick and it's quite expensive. And the added trauma of that is the insurance company basically wages a little bit of a war on you after basically getting you to send wads and wads of documents, which just wears you down, right? And you compare that to another YouTuber who just sat at home and did his thing, didn't incur any costs, any efforts, anything like that, and they end up doing a lot better than what you did, right? And and it's not to talk about that, it's not to be self-indulgent, it's to simply compare that to Van Gogh doing that on a much bigger scale. He goes to the south of France and he basically sets up a house and he spends a lot of money on gas, which you're going to hear him talk about in the letter. He spends a lot of money on painting the house, buying furniture for the house, and then he suffers a serious health setback. And he then spends a year, can't just come home. He spends a year essentially in a kind of a hospital. Meanwhile, that year, the year that he's in hospital, it's not just any year, it's the year of the great um, World Fair in Paris. That's why they built the Eiffel Tower, right? And all the artists are going to be there. And where's he? He's nowhere, right? And it's also in that context that he paints Starry Night. The fact that he's the biggest loser in this whole equation, right? What I'm trying to make you aware of is that he could easily have been overcome by with bitterness, with feelings of self-pity, with feelings of depression. And I'm sure he felt some of those feelings. I'm sure he felt frustrated, to put it mildly. But somehow he also managed to continue working despite this incredible setback. And an argument that I've made, certainly in my book, The Murder of Van Gogh, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, and also during the Van Gogh letters, and a lot of you, I'm very glad to see, have um, repeated this argument, which is if Van Gogh was going to take his own life, the time to do it was when he was alone in the asylum, when he had no friends with him, when he had minimal support, and when the conditions around him were pretty traumatizing. Mad people screaming, unknown strangers being nuisances, and you know what I mean. And in that situation of being completely isolated, minus an ear, and he'd essentially been betrayed by Gauguin. And in a way, although he had support from his brother never visited him at the asylum. So in a way, he was really on his own, right? And so, how did he get himself out of that hole? What I'm trying to say is, if he was very depressed, the time to give up was in the asylum, when it really had felt like he'd lost everything. And instead, what does he do? He fights back. He paints, and he dreams again, right? And part of that dreaming was Starry Night, which we're going to deal with. Also, you don't recover from something traumatic, physically, psychologically, like this. It takes time. And it looks like it took Van Gogh at least 3 or 4 months. And it's not to say he'd recovered by then, but he was well on the road to some sort of recovery by then, with still a long way to go as well. Stephanie, what are you asking about? He actually tried. Not quite sure what you mean with that. That's a nice sentiment, Murphy. Okay, so let's continue reading this letter. Now he talks about Gauguin in the fourth paragraph, and this is where you've got to be wary of. You've got to do a bit of statement analysis. He says, "What you tell me about Gauguin gives me tremendous pleasure." And do you think that that is true, right? And it makes you also wonder, does he really offer his sincere congratulations here, or is he just being polite? And if you know Van Gogh, he is kind of a martyr figure. If there's anyone who thought of Van Gogh as a kind of martyr figure, it was Gauguin, who painted him, who seemed to think of him as a kind of a martyr figure in some ways. And there's certainly reason to believe that he thought of himself that way, given how he dealt with the Borinage. His brother would send him money which he needed, and he'd send it back. He would give his clothes away. He would paint or do a sketch and then use that as kindling in a fire to keep warm. I mean, he was so self-deprecating that the church folk, that the church elders, had him kicked out of the church because he was this stinking embarrassment to them. He was living this very, he was kind of living like a pilgrim. And that was something he wanted to do. Remember, he studied to be a pastor for a long time. And then he took this idea of ministering to ordinary people almost into his art. But that doesn't mean that that whole idea of being self-sacrificing simply disappeared, right? Just have a look at your comments. Okay, so let's go back to this letter. So he says, "What you tell me about Gauguin gives me tremendous pleasure. That is to say that he has not given up his project of returning to the tropics." And that, in a way, is a little bit of a glimpse of Van Gogh's mindset as well, because is Van Gogh going to give up his project? And I guess you could say, what is his project? What is Van Gogh's project? And then he says that is the right road for him. What is the right road for Van Gogh at this point? I suppose one could generally say he needs to continue painting. He mustn't give up painting. Then he says, "I think I see light in his plan, and I approve of it heartily. Naturally, I regret it, but you can understand that provided all goes well with him, that is all I want." And so there you have a sense that he is being truthful, that he provides a positive endorsement while also saying that he kind of has mixed feelings about it, meaning that what is good for Gauguin isn't necessarily good for him, certainly not in his current predicament. Then he says, if you can get you talk a little to CM about and that's not 100%, isn't that Mauve, about the future of his business and whether his son will be able to keep it going. Let me just make sure of that. Where do I have that letter? So just give me a second. Period. So just FYI, in about 5 weeks, Van Gogh is no longer going to be in Aal. Sorry, no, it's a little bit longer than that. I think in May, early May, he actually leaves Aal. 8th of May, I think he leaves Aal. So he actually tries to hang in there for 4 fraught months, and eventually loses that battle, and then he heads to the asylum. I just want to get to the letter, this letter on another site. Just give me a second. 7th of January. So this is another version of this. And you can see it's a little bit like the Bible. Is it this letter? Is that's the 7th of January? We're looking for the one from the 9th. That's this one. As I said, it's a little bit like the Bible. This translation deviates slightly from the other one. So where he says, herewith I repeat them to you, meaning the sincere congratulations. This translation has it as simply as I repeat them here to you. Right? So just a slightly different interpretation. CM is Cornelis van Gogh, Uncle Cor. Okay. So I just wanted to make sure of that. Anyway, let's go back to this source. So it's the uncle. If you can get to talk a little to Uncle Cor about the future of his business and whether his son will be able to keep it going as long as Cor himself has, he should even make it his duty to listen to you. You can see in this letter is quite matter of fact. It's not as though he's shaken to the core about his brother's engagement. It's not really factoring into his overall psychology. It's well done, congratulations, and then he's back to business, right? Then Tierstig must admit the Impressionists, or at least believe in Eugene Delacroix, and then Tierstig, and you would give yourself a very strong hand, which Boussard would have to count on. What was really enjoyable when I was in Manhattan was going to revisiting the Metropolitan Museum, and also the Guggenheim, with the other Stephanie, and just seeing a lot of the Delacroix that are there as well, and you kind of just get a sense of the artist through the art actually hanging there, the artist that Van Gogh refers to so often. Anyway, it says, what is the 89 exhibition going to be? That's a reference to what? What is that a reference to? And again, what do you think is on Van Gogh's mind right now? Don't you think that at this point he thinks he's still going to be going there? At this point in January, early January, he thinks he's okay. I've lost my ear and I'm just going to get going again. It's not much of a setback. Now, if he was really, what's the word, mentally ill in a kind of a global sense, not like just a single setback, a random incident. If he had like a long running period of mental illness, then you can imagine it would be crazy to even think about going to this exhibition. And if you didn't know Van Gogh very well, if you didn't know his situation very well, you might imagine that after that him cutting off his ear was almost a way of saying, I just can't do this anymore and I'm going to the asylum, or he was just going mad as it is. But here he's conscious about the exhibition. You get the feeling he's still in the running for it, don't you? Don't forget the anatomy lesson for M. Ray, right? And that is this painting. Not a very good version of it. But you can't help thinking that because Van Gogh is talking to doctors, because he's aware of the interior of his own ear where it's severed, that picture kind of rings a bell. That picture resonates with him. Does that make sense? He has been talking to a doctor, and so he's thinking about art in medical terms. And this is a very famous painting by Rembrandt called The Anatomy Lesson. He says he had already told me before this morning that he was fond of painting, though he knew nothing about it, and that he wished to learn. I told him he ought to turn collector. And I mean, there was another doctor that Van Gogh would also make friends with, and that would be Dr. Gachet, who was a collector, but that he should not try to paint himself. And that is what Dr. Gachet did. And it seems like Dr. Gachet was a little bit crooked, possibly, in his desperation to become a famous painter in his own right. Anyway, he says, that means that perhaps we shall find two friends in the doctors here, Ray and the Paris doctor. And I wonder whether that isn't a reference to Dr. Gachet. I told him that the Brias of Montpellier had a certain family likeness to us, and that therefore we were only continuing in the south what Monticelli and Brias began. Bria, check, there's a name that's very similar to yours. Bria, are you in Canada right now? I have had, and so this is now what I mentioned earlier about, think about the setback that this is for Van Gogh. I can tell you when I went to America in October and I missed a flight to LA, I had to book another flight. I spent about a week in a hotel, basically not doing anything. And then I was also sick for many days afterwards, just sort of one day sick, another day healthy, whatever. And that felt pretty expensive for me. It felt like a bit of a setback. But you can only imagine what it is like with this, where he's put in weeks and weeks of his time painting the house, making it livable, putting his heart and soul into it. His own paintings hang on the walls. He really prepared this place for Gauguin, only to be kind of kicked in the teeth by Gauguin, right? And so look at what he says here. I have had to pay quite a number of things on leaving the hospital, and though I'm in no sort of hurry for several days, it would be nice if you could send me 50 francs within the next few days. Now, where over here he refers to Gauguin in a kind of positive way, and he does also mention a little bit of feelings of regret. Here he expands on that a little bit. He says, I think the mistake in old Gauguin's calculations was that he is rather too much in the habit of ignoring the inevitable expenses of house rent, a charwoman, and a lot of worldly things of the kind. And in other words, you kind of get the idea that Gauguin was quite a spoilt fellow, used to living quite large, used to indulging, and that was probably an area where the artists rubbed one another the wrong way, where the one artist was very self-indulgent, the other artist was extremely what's the word I'm looking for? What's a good word for when you almost like penny pinching? Just trying to think of a good word for that. Any thoughts? The official meaning is a person who's unwilling to spend money, but it's not really that. Van Gogh was very um, frugal. That's the word I'm looking for, frugal. I wouldn't say he was a miser, it's not like that he's selfish or that he's um, it's not out of selfishness, it's out of a lifetime of actually not having a lot of money, right? I was actually thinking the other day that I've never flown business class. And I mean, when you fly economy class, it's kind of torture. But I don't know whether I would ever fly business class. And I don't think that's being miserly. I think that's just being practical. I mean, you spend so much money when you do fly business class. Yeah, so I don't think he's stingy. I think he's just cautious with money because he never has a lot. And it's very different to Gauguin, who you can imagine enjoys a big feast. He likes eating, he likes womanizing, he likes drinking, he likes excess. And in that sense, these guys are totally different to one another. Anyway, so he says, now all those things are weighing more on our shoulders, well, actually on Theo's shoulders. And you can see here that Van Gogh's not that bothered by the fact that he's getting engaged. He doesn't seem to say something like, I mean, he doesn't have this paragraph. Think about it in a statement analysis sense. This paragraph, let's say that part of the paragraph, that if that had appeared nearer the top, let's say in the third paragraph or the second paragraph, you could say that the first thing Van Gogh was thinking when he heard that his brother was getting engaged was, oh shit, the money's going to dry up. And maybe that was a thought that he had, but he certainly doesn't mention it right off the bat in his letter. He seems to be fairly sensible and fairly, what's the word, fairly um, is not anxious, is simply aware, is conscious that the bills are going to be a little bit difficult. And of course, it's not his problem, it's actually Theo's problem, right? when he says they're going to be weighing more on our shoulders, actually, no, it's on Theo's shoulders. Theo's paying for everything. Then he says, once we have accepted them, other artists could stay with me without having those expenses. So you can see at this point, Van Gogh is basically just thinking, okay, who's next? Gauguin didn't work out. Let's just sort out what we need to pay, and then let's go on, and who's going to be the next artist. It's a little bit like when I had COVID in Long Island, and I thought, well, you know what, this is quite serious, but if I just stick with it, I think I can still make something out of this journey, right? Although I have some additional expenses, I think I can still get something for my effort, right? And then I persevered, right? Again, I'm not trying to bring myself into it to be self-indulgent. I'm simply trying to illustrate it in a very contemporary way. Then he says, they've just told me that during my absence, the owner of my house, that's how he thinks about it, right? The owner of my house, the yellow house, made an arrangement with a fellow who has a tobacco shop to turn me out and give this tobacconist the house. So you kind of get the feeling that the folks who are his neighbors and his landlord and the people who live there, they don't really want him there anymore, because there's been too much drama. There's been womanizing, there's been screaming, the police have come around there, and he's also kind of like a migrant or an immigrant. He's not French. He's not from there, and he seems like a bit of a weirdo. He's a kind of a loser who looks, to some extent, disheveled. They don't really understand him, and so after what's just happened, they really want to get rid of him. And at this point, he thinks, okay, they're trying to take my house back. I'll sort it out. But actually, he's not going to win this battle. It's actually early January, 9th of January, and it'll be about 4 long months before he literally gets the boot, and then he's somewhere else. By the way, if you want to follow this letter, here's the link. Mel says, I don't think he would have mentioned it to Theo at that point. Mentioned what? Okay, so then he goes on to say, this has rather upset me. So that is what's upsetting him. He's losing his home. Right? That is what is upsetting him. Now let me ask you, do you think something else has upset him? Do you think something else has upset him? In other words, do you think he's upset that his brother has gotten engaged? Is that his primary concern? Do you think that he is upset that Gauguin has left? I think he is. But his primary concern is now that I could lose this house. Right? So what's the other thing to mention? Anyway, he says, let's just go back to this. For I'm not much disposed to have myself turned out of this house practically in disgrace, when it was I who had it repainted inside and out and had the gas put in. In fact, who had made it habitable, a house which had been shut up and uninhabited for a considerable time, and which I took in a very poor condition. This is to warn you that perhaps at Easter, if the owner persists, I shall ask your advice about it, and that in all this I only consider myself a representative defending the interest of our artist friends. And you almost get this feeling that he is thinking about some kind of legal battle. He talks about, I consider myself a representative defending the interest of our artist friends. He says, besides, between now and then, it is more than likely that a good deal of water will have gone under the bridge. So he's anticipating a battle, and he's right. There is going to be a battle, and guess what? He's going to lose it. He is also mentioning that he feels disgrace. He feels that he's being treated in a way that he should be ashamed and humiliated, right? This is what is really bothering him, is that at this point in his life, he's being kicked out of somewhere that he lives. And by the way, it's not the first time. He was in a way kicked out of where he stayed with his parents. He was kicked out of the Borinage. He was just trying to think. He was sort of unceremoniously fired from Goupil, as far as I can remember. And when you've lost a place that you've become attached to, how can I put it? Not by choice. If you forcefully turned out, it's traumatic. And I think Michelle Troconis possibly felt a bit like that every weekend. I don't really want to talk about true crime in this space, but it's not a very nice feeling when you are forced to leave what you consider your home. And that is what is upsetting him. Now, you can also imagine another thing that could upset him is Gauguin saying to him, you know what, I think I'm gonna skedaddle. You know, it's not really working out for me here in the South. I think I'm gonna skedaddle. Couldn't that also have upset him? Couldn't that also have upset him? And so we are going to talk a little bit about the answer to this question. You know, what prompted, what relevance does the Theo's engagement have on the air incident? And I think there are two ways one can look at it. We'll come back to this. But the one way is you can say that Van Gogh is very upset. He's very upset that his brother's engaged. Is very upset because it means he's going to get less support. And as a result, in grinding frustration, he cuts his ear off. I think that's an incredibly pathetic and poor and weak. It basically shows someone who doesn't understand Van Gogh at all. And the reason I say that is, if you look at what happens a couple of months later, his brother has a child. And then you could say, by the same token, his brother having a child, was that a catastrophe for him? So now that you've got a child, you're not going to be able to look after me. And I think that was something that did come up. That was something that he was concerned about. But he mentioned it to his brother. He said, I'm a little bit worried about this. And his brother said, no, you don't need to be worried. And then he was fine. And I mean, who was a really big supporter of Van Gogh was Jo Bonga. I mean, if it wasn't really for her, we wouldn't have these letters today. And so to say, on the one hand, you could make the argument that the engagement made the self-pitying person just lose hope, and then he cut off his ear. But does he seem self-pitying in all of this that we've read so far? Does he mention the engagement in any? Does he talk about the costs or anything? He's talking about the cost of this house that he wants to keep. He's not saying, Theo, is it okay if I keep the house? It seems like he's kind of insisting on it. But anyway, if you want to make the case that the engagement pushed him over the edge, then you can kind of take that same silly psychology and apply it to when Theo had a child. That also pushed him off the edge, and this time he took his own life. The thing is, that doesn't really compute if you understand the artist, I believe, properly. I think that is the belief of what's his name, Martin Bailey. I think that is what he thinks happened. I agree with that. I agree with that. Okay, so let's continue. So he says, and the great thing is to not worry about it. Okay. Has Bernard given you back Sylvester's book? I shall not. I shall need the exact title to make the doctors in question read the book. And then, yeah, he gives his own diagnosis. He says, physically, I'm well. The wound is healing very well, and the great loss of blood is being made up because I eat and digest well. What is to be feared most is insomnia. So, from his own mouth, he's basically said, I'm upset about possibly losing the house. I'm upset about my landlord going behind my back. I'm happy for Gauguin. I'm happy for you getting engaged. I'm struggling with two things. I can't sleep because my ear hurts. That is a very obvious thing to imagine. He certainly can't sleep with his head on one side. You know, let me just bring myself back for a moment. So, if I can indulge you guys for a moment, I once uh, went to do an Ironman on the island of Jeju in South Korea. I won't bore you with the details, but I was playing with two young ladies in the sea, and just kind of splashing water at one another. I must have been early 30s or something. And anyway, we were playing in the water, and at one point I dived. It's like in shallow water, sort of thigh deep or between knee and thigh deep in the sea. And I think at one point I sort of dived between the legs of this one girl, and she kind of instinctively closed her legs or did something with her leg, and her knee hit me in the ear. And whatever water was in this area in front of the ear got pushed into the ear, almost like I don't know, very forcefully. And the result was that it burst my eardrum, right? And so on the eve of the Ironman, I got this really horrible injury. My ear actually bled a little bit. I had blood in my mouth as well. But the point is, that night I really couldn't sleep because my ear made these horrible squeaky sounds. It's almost like if you imagine a balloon um, where you're letting air out and it kind of screeches like that. There was sort of moisture in my ear, obviously from blood, and if I just did that, moved my um, jaw muscles a little bit, the ear would kind of squeak, and so I really couldn't sleep that night. And you obviously couldn't sleep with your head on one side, and that was just from a relatively minor thing. I did get treatment with doctors that sorted it out, but yeah, Vincent's lost his entire ear, and you can imagine that just trying to go to sleep at night would be difficult. And so he says, um, I fight this insomnia by a very, very strong dose of camphor in my pillow. But he emphasizes what is to be feared most is insomnia. And the doctor has not spoken about it to me, nor have I spoken of it to him either. But I'm fighting it myself. There you get a sense of a little bit of subtlety with Van Gogh. Is he doesn't tell everybody everything. He doesn't say to his doctor quite a simple thing. Doctor, the thing that I'm struggling with the most is I can't sleep. He doesn't even mention it to his doctor. So this is another clue that Van Gogh isn't necessarily what you see is what you get. He doesn't, although he's fairly honest. He doesn't necessarily wear his entire heart on his sleeve. He is capable of fighting some of his demons privately, right? And that I think actually shows a strong psychology, not a weak one. And the other thing is, although he doesn't tell his doctor, he does tell Theo. In other words, he doesn't communicate to everyone around him every little thing that's bothering him, but he can tell Theo in a way that's not hysterical or overdramatic. He just says, I'm dealing with this issue. It's quite a serious issue that I'm dealing with, but I think I know how to deal with it. Thanks so much, Trinity. Thank you. I hope we're going to see Stephanie too, because I know she enjoyed these. Anyway, he goes on to say, look at these words. He says, I was very much afraid of sleeping alone in the house, and I've been afraid that I should not be able to sleep. And that makes you wonder again what's really going on in his mind. Why would he be afraid of sleeping alone in the house? And again, you can interpret this two ways. The one is, if he's alone, could he do something to himself? And the other one is, if someone did attack him, does he have a horrible memory of that? Do you know what I mean? If something horrible happened with Gauguin, maybe he needs to be comforted. Anyway, he goes on to say, but that is quite over, and I dare to think that it will not reappear. And of course it did, and it would. He would start struggling with his mental health from this point onwards. He says, my suffering from this in the hospital was frightful. And yet through it all, even when I was so far gone that it was more than a swoon, I can tell you as a curiosity that I kept on thinking about Gauguin. Gauguin and I had been talking about Gauguin before, and I'd pointed out to Gauguin that Gauguin had said, I'm saving myself up for the Orlésiennes, meaning the woman, right? Then he says, now you know how subtle Gauguin is, so when you get back to Paris, just tell Gauguin that I admit that up to the present, I've been powerless to paint the woman of all as anything but poisonous. And I think that is quite a big statement to make. Another possibility, you might say the reason Van Gogh cut off his ear was because of a woman, and that woman was Theo's fiancée. The reason Van Gogh lost it was because this guy who'd been single and had struggled so much with his love life, when he heard that his brother was engaged, he just lost it, right? Does that really sound likely? Or is it more likely that there was a woman in his orbit, more particularly a woman that was possibly a woman that Gauguin was also interested in, and this caused an argument between the two artists, a woman. I mean, and the other thing that I think, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of, did you know that Gauguin had wanted to run away with Bernard's sister? Did you guys know that? In other words, when Gauguin finally left where he was, Brittany, I think, to go south to meet Van Gogh, what had been going on prior to that was Gauguin had been in an affair with Bernard's sister, and that affair ended when Bernard's sister's father found out about the affair and didn't want Gauguin to see his daughter. And so once that happened, Gauguin basically cut his losses, and then he went to Arles. And you can almost imagine that. You might say, how did Van Gogh react to Gauguin sorry, how did Van Gogh react to Theo's engagement? Well, another way of looking at that is, how did Gauguin react? Because he had wanted to get engaged to Bernard's sister. And so he may have thought, I still love her, and for, I can't let go of her, whatever. Um, and there may have been a bunch of other reasons as well. But news that Theo had gotten engaged may have actually made the two of certainly made Gauguin think about someone who he'd cared about, right? Another thing that's just very basic is, you could imagine if on the 23rd of December, the weird thing is there's no letter saying, "Hi, Vincent, I'm engaged." I think a letter was sent on the 23rd, but there's no record of it. If he did send a letter like that, you can imagine that Vincent would say, "Hey, let's go out and celebrate." And if he didn't say that, Gauguin would probably say that, "Hey, your brother's gotten engaged. Let's go and have a drink on your brother, and let's also let's celebrate the opposite sex," kind of thing. And in other words, that thing so close to Christmas, that announcement so close to Christmas, probably would have led to celebration and revelry, and didn't it? And in that celebration and revelry, maybe people drank too much absinthe. Maybe Van Gogh misbehaved, but maybe Gauguin misbehaved as well. And maybe in part of that whole thing, Gauguin said, "Old fellow, I'm going to have to leave you. I've made up my mind. I'm going back to um, I'm going back. I'm going back." And Vincent may have said, "Fuck that. You're not going anywhere. Blah blah blah." And I'm talking about a drunk Van Gogh, and a drunk Van Gogh basically saying, "There's no way you are leaving. I've put so much into this, and you owe my brother." Blah blah blah. And Gauguin said, "Get out of my way." You can imagine a thing happening that way. Anyway, so what do you guys think of that theory and that explanation? Mel says, "I do." Yeah, it is in my book. Is in my book. Okay, that's at least in my book. It's supported with a lot of his own words and a timeline and all that. Anyway, it's interesting that he calls the woman poisonous. It tells you that that's a very strong word. It tells you that he doesn't really have anything against Theo. He doesn't even seem to have a lot against Gauguin or even his landlord. His biggest gripe is with the woman of all, who he calls poisonous. Did they say something to Gauguin? Did did they tell him something? Did they tell him something about Gauguin? Did the woman of all make um, Gauguin want to go back to his woman? Anyway, he says, "He must not believe Gauguin if Gauguin speaks well of my work too early, for it has only been a sick man so far." He's referring to his own work as a sick man's. "Now, if I recover, I must begin again, and I shall not again reach the heights to which sickness partially led me." And this is where he's kind of starting to dream in this letter. He's talking about beginning again. And he's already quite modest. He says, "I don't think I'm going to reach the heights um, to which sickness partially led me." I'm not quite sure what he means by that. Does he mean loneliness? Does he mean actual sickness like syphilis? What do you think he means? And of course he's wrong. He says, "I shall not again reach the heights." Well, guess what? In 4 months, he will paint Starry Night, and then he certainly will reach those heights. And he will actually surpass those heights. But it's a very interesting, even cryptic statement. Now, if I recover, I must begin again, and I shall not again reach the heights to which sickness partially led me. Well, he will. I should have liked, but the question here is, what is he talking about when he talks about sickness? What do you think he means? I should have liked very much to give another picture to Reve, just because I quite agree with you that it would be well to put M. Ray, that's the doctor, Monsieur Ray, in touch with Reve. But you could quite well tell Reve that it would be a good thing to send Monsieur Ray back here to the hospital with the doctor's degree he's trying to get. He's very, very useful here, and they will be desperately in need of a doctor here at Arles in the time to come, with cholera and the plague, etc. Right, and these are pretty serious sicknesses, as well as the French disease, syphilis, during this period. Continuing so threatening in the region of Marseille. Now Ray was born here and would be no use in Paris or elsewhere, whereas once furnished with the full medical authority of Paris, he would do real miracles here in a time of calamity. Again, this doesn't sound like someone who's so mentally ill, so compromised, so self-pitying that he is incapable of thinking of anyone else or thinking in a rational way. Is incredibly astute for someone who's just lost his ear. I mean, how can I put this? Um, so I've just got a little something in my water here. I just want to get it out. How can I put this? I think I know how to make this kind of an allegory. Do you remember when I was in America and I was beyond the Long Island stage? Maybe I was in California, or I was in Texas, or I was in New Mexico, or I was in Colorado, or I was in. I'm not sure if I made any members only videos in South Carolina, but can you remember how I would invariably talk in a way in those short little videos in a way that was sort of related to me and my health? Do you remember that? Whereas here, just think how little of the content of this entire letter is dedicated to him talking about himself. And I mean, if you think about it, if you've lost your ear, what else would there be? What else would you talk about? It would be difficult to not talk about that at length. It would be difficult to not talk about how it happened, what happened, and all the drama, but in kind of painful detail. And yet he doesn't do that. Is it seems like he's transcended it. And that's to some extent quite concerning, but it's also quite impressive, isn't it? He's not um, mired in self pity. Do you agree with that? So have a look at some of your comments. Yvonne says, I know I've made those kind of promises myself from time to time. We also know that Yvonne had a little bit of a difficulty for a while, and we always missed you when we did these Van Gogh letters. It's really good to have you back with us. I think, Yvonne, you can also, to some extent, identify with what I'm talking about, where unexpectedly something happens to you that comes at a kind of a personal cost, and now you must come out the other side. And what do you do? You're on the other side now. What do? You feel like you've lost time. You feel like you've lost some of your life force. You feel like maybe even you've lost a little bit of confidence, right? And that is where Van Gogh is as well. You know, he's got to get back on the horse, right? Then he says, certainly we have no right to meddle in medical affairs. Only Rivet himself will perhaps be of the same opinion, at any rate, insofar as an Arlesian is not a Parisian and vice versa. Did you stop at Bredar? Naturally, I'm inclined to think so. Reassure mother, especially with regard to me. So that is what he says to his brother, what to say to his mother. Tell her I'm fine. Um, Reassure her, right? He doesn't say, tell mom to send me some cotton wool or something, you know. He says, tell her I'm fine. Then he says, then he talks again about Gauguin, Gauguin, Gauguin. You know, Gauguin, if you think about it, look how much Gauguin features in this letter. So this is about Theo and his fiancée. There he talks about his fear. And then Gauguin is in the fourth paragraph. And he's saying, I think that's right for him and I approve of it. And I hope things go well with him. And then talks about something else. And then again, he mentions a couple of doctors. Then he mentions Gauguin again. Then he talks about the house. Then he talks about Bernard and then how his health is, right? And then again, Gauguin over there, Gauguin, Gauguin, Gauguin. Yeah, so I think it would be quite a contest between his references to the doctor and Gauguin, who he talks about the most. But he certainly refers to Gauguin quite early on, then in the middle, comes back to him, and then at the end. He says, have you seen the portrait of me which Gauguin has, and have you seen the portrait which Gauguin did of himself during those last few days? If you compare the self-portrait Gauguin did then with the one that I still have of him, which he sent me from Britain in exchange for mine, you will see that on the whole, he himself got rested here. What has become of Hahn and Isaacson? I did hope vaguely to see them here one day if Gauguin had stayed longer with me. And with this in mind, I've taken two little rooms which were going to be vacant in the house, which I'm now occupying completely. The rent is $21.50 a month. I dare not urge this anymore, seeing that Gauguin is gone, and especially considering that the journey south costs a good deal. Give them my kind regards when you see them again. Roulon wants to be remembered to you. He was very pleased with what you said of him in your letter of today, but then he fully deserves it. With a handshake, and of course, you know, I wish you happy days with your fiancée. So even at the very end of this letter, he remembers. It's not like he's such a shallow, superficial guy that he just says, "Oh, sincere congratulations," and then he forgets about it. He ends off the letter by remembering, and the very last reference in his letter is to his fiancée. I wish you happy days with your fiancée. Do you really think that that is not sincere? I don't think he would have mentioned his financial issues if he thought that. It's funny, the word fiancé and finance are almost same letters. I don't think he would have mentioned that if he thought it was a deal breaker. Then he says, ever yours, Vincent. Regards to Andre Bonga, that is his fiance's brother, if he is there too. Okay. So from this letter on the 9th of January, the next one is significantly later, the 17th of January. Quite a big jump. It's almost a 2-week break, right? Before we get to this letter, I want to come back to this question. Why is it important to dream? And before I deal with it, I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Without giving you too much context, why is it important to dream? Let's hear what you guys say. Now would be really a good time to have a couple of guests on and just to hear what you do say. Yeah, that is a unusually long time for him not to write a letter. So Wendy says, sorry, Stephanie says it gives you something to look forward to. Susan says dreaming is hope for the future. Helena says to keep hope alive. Chelsea says to keep hopeful. Mel Stiller says dreams take us out of our reality. Wendy says it brings out the subconscious. Robbie Robbins says to give ourselves hope, to keep you sane, inspiration to continue on. No dream, no hope. Jody says to stir the imagination of what might be possible. And it's actually a broad question with actually a lot of different ways to look at it. You can think about it in basically two ways. Basically, when you go to bed tonight, like right where I am now, it's 11 o'clock at night. I actually had a dream the other night, and I know it's different to saying where you consciously dream, you consciously imagine a certain future for yourself. Those are the two versions of the same thing. The one is a involuntary, natural thing that happens to you where you close your eyes and almost some of the residues of thoughts and feelings percolate through the subconscious and they come out in a dream, which has quite a lot of rich feelings associated with it, right? And if you think about Starry Night, it kind of has a dreamlike quality about it, doesn't it? It kind of doesn't seem real. And I do think sometimes we need to take a break from reality, especially if reality is extremely painful, extremely traumatic. We kind of need a break from it. And a dream, whether it's a daydream or a fairy tale or a dream for the future, can sometimes be that. Even if it's unrealistic, it can be a bit of a break. Hi, Stephanie. Good to see you. Please tell your mom happy birthday. Happy 91st birthday. Your mother's birthday is on the exact same day as my mother's birthday, 3rd Feb. I'm assuming it's 3rd Feb. Anyway, really good to see you here. So this is what I want to kind of share. So not that long ago, I had a dream about a frog, and it was very visceral and very visual. And although I think there's something to do with, I think I'd been fishing, and the frog, I'd actually caught the frog, if I can put it that way. In other words, I'd hooked the frog, and I was actually trying to catch the frog so that I could catch the frog and take the hook out of its mouth. But the frog was so lively and so quick that it was like this chase in all sorts of environments, trying to catch up to this frog to remove the hook. And anyway, the next morning I Googled, what do dreams about frogs mean? And I'm not saying if you Google what do dreams about frogs mean, that is the absolute answer, right? It could be other things as well. But anyway, this is what Google came up with. I don't know if you guys can see that. Frog dreams represent change. Frogs are linked to transformation, right? And I've got to say, I feel that quite strongly at the moment. I feel like I'm ready to train again. I'm also ready to go to the mountains. I'm just in a different place that I was in for quite a few months. And so I don't know whether that is true, but it certainly does feel true. But that's not really what we're talking about. Another way to think about it is just in its own terms. Why is it important to dream? Not meaning where you sit down and you say, I want to dream for my life. I want to do X, Y, Z. It is when you go to sleep and you have a dream. Why is that actually important? And the answer, I think, is in the same way, you know that when you leave a computer on for a long period of time, it kind of becomes unstable. Just take any computer and leave it on day and night for a while, it kind of becomes unstable. Um, the same happens with us. If we don't get enough sleep and if we don't dream, our consciousness becomes unstable and unsettled. And so, in a way, our minds, our brains are computers that also need to defragment, they need to consolidate, that they need to make sense of a lot of unresolved feelings and thoughts and feelings that we have, and maybe by the end of the day, we haven't actually been able to resolve them. And so we go to sleep with a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of unresolved feelings. And then in our dream state, our subconsciousness kind of makes sense of all of these loose ends. And so, just from that perspective, it's really important that we dream, is that when we wake up the next morning, we kind of in a state of stability, right? And so I think Van Gogh's insomnia definitely didn't help. And I think anyone with sleep apnea, it doesn't help you um, in terms of being effective. It doesn't help you in terms of whatever issue you have, whether it's anxiety or whatever. Lack of sleep simply just undermines you in whatever way. The other way to think about it is in terms of a real dream where you say, this is what I'd like to do. And if you think about Starry Night wasn't the first time Van Gogh had painted stars at night. He painted the stars of the Rhone. And he'd actually mentioned it quite a few times. He also painted the night cafe at the outside of it, where you also saw a little bit of the stars above the night cafe. And so he'd had this idea in his mind for quite a long time to paint the stars at night. And we're going to talk about the Starry Night in a lot more detail. But what I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize is Starry Night was in a way Van Gogh observing his own thoughts. In other words, the sky, it's a fictional village that he painted. In other words, when he looked outside his window, he didn't see the village that you see in Starry Night, right? He painted a fictional village, but I think the sky above that was how he thought of his own mental state. If you think about air in a way that is, let's say, animated and violent and so on, in a way that is you symbolically representing yourself, your own state of mind. And I was talking to my brother about it while we were riding today. Starry Night, on the one hand, looks to you, to me, to anyone except the guy who painted it, looks quite magical. You see these, stars twirling and so on. And it seems, my brother also said it also looks beautiful. It looks magical and it looks beautiful. But if it's totally different, if Van Gogh said to you, you know what, I was actually painting my state of mind, you might say, you have a magical and beautiful state of mind. You have a beautiful mind. And it might not be untrue to say, but Van Gogh might say, you're not getting the message of the painting. I was actually painting the chaos. I was actually painting the violence in the night that when the night's supposed to be peaceful, it's very disturbed. It's very torrid. I'm not able to rest. And so something that the world interprets in this positive way, Van Gogh may not actually have meant it in that way, right? Have you ever thought of that? And so on the one hand, you could say it looks magical. On the other hand, you might say, no, it looks chaotic. You could also say, well, isn't it both? And isn't that a good description for your own consciousness? That your own consciousness is some parts magic, some parts chaos, and the one needs the other to exist. I know in, I think it's called The Witcher, they talk about harnessing from chaos energy that you create magic out of, as far as I remember that. And so, if you think about also when you sleep at night and you have a dream, again, the question, why is it important to dream? Well, because the dream state takes the chaos of reality, all of these loose ends and all of these things that don't quite add up and all these things that are unresolved, takes that chaos and it turns little patterns out of them that may not be true, but help you to wake up the next morning with, in a way, a clean slate, if that makes sense. Yvonne says, this makes me want to talk to Vincent right this moment and ask him. Well, you know that you can speak to an AI Van Gogh, right? You can do that. So just to touch on it in a little bit more detail, we'll come back to his letters. There's a really interesting article from bettersleep.com, talks about the psychology of dreams. I highly recommend you read it, but we will touch on it in some detail now. It just says most people think of dreams as nothing more than random firings of a tired brain, but research has shown dreams are quite complex and they offer valuable insights into our psychological state, right? What are dreams? Dreams are a sequence of images, ideas, emotions, and sensations that occur in the mind, right? That sequence is the brain's, the mind's attempt to make order out of what is possibly a chaotic day. I mean, yesterday I was supposed to cycle with my brother, and it was chaos. My one wheel was flat. Anyway, I can moan about all sorts of things, but look at this. Timmy, can I just do that? The content and purpose of dreams are still not fully understood. Dreams occur in the rapid eye movement stage when brain activity is high. So the brain isn't just kind of in default mode in like a peripheral setting. The brain is actively kind of computing, if, for the lack of a better word. Researchers believe, listen to this, dreams may help people process emotions. And I think that is really something to highlight. You know, something that happened to me, I'm just giving you an example. I hope you don't see it as being self-indulgent. I was walking my dog the other day, and a friend of mine had just finished walking her dog. And I said, just walk another lap with me. And she said, no. And then she got in her car, waved, and left. And I thought that was a little bit strange. And then I continued walking my dog. And I didn't really think about it anymore, but it was a little bit emotionally disturbing. Like, and so you have little things like that are a little bit strange. Earlier today, I called my dad and said we should go out to dinner, and he hasn't felt about today in a happy way that I've felt about today. Today is my mother's birthday. It's not her death day, and and I had quite a nice day today. I don't think my father had a very good day today, and then that news is a bit disturbing. And anyway, dreams help us to process those emotions where we don't quite understand what's going on in the real world and in other people's hearts and minds. And so the dream basically just provides you with some kind of settled way of thinking about it. We learn through dreams as well, we solve problems. Um, Some findings suggest that dreams may be linked to real world events like illness, grief, or trauma. Have you ever dreamt about someone who has actually died? I've had a couple of dreams about Alex. I've had many dreams about my mother. You sometimes dream about someone who's died. I know the dream I had about Alex was quite a relief. Other research indicates that dreams may be meaningless or random. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think some dreams are just, what's the word? There's a lot of noise in our lives, a lot of chatter, and some of that gets into. Sometimes you may be half awake and you're hearing something, and then your mind makes something out of that, and that's not necessarily meaningful. It's just your mind doing its thing. So I don't think it's necessarily either or. I don't think it's um, all meaningful and all meaningless. I think it's a combination. And that's why Starry Night is kind of like that. It's a combination of chaos and magic, isn't it? And how are you able to organize the chaos and the magic in your life? So I'm not going to talk about lucid dreaming. Alcohol can trigger nightmares. Remember, alcohol takes away your inhibitions. What do dreams mean? Freud believed that dreams are a window into our deepest anxieties and desires. Um, he thought that every dream represented the release of sexual tension. I think it's not necessarily just sexual tension. I think that's also part of it. It's also just tension, the release of tension. Dreams deal with psychological tension. Okay, so that's the one thing I wanted to share. This is also quite an interesting article. Van Gogh's Night Visions. Can you guys see that? It's from the Smithsonian Magazine. Now, I don't know if you guys remember me saying this. Some people thought that Van Gogh painted that cypress tree as a way of, as an allegory to the Eiffel Tower. And this was his way of thinking about that, about the World Fair. And I don't think he approved of the Eiffel Tower. And anyway, let's see what what this article says. This is a really good article as well. So we'll deal with this article and then go back to Van Gogh letters. With his bright sunflowers, searing wheat fields and blazing yellow skies, Vincent van Gogh was fanatic about light. Van Gogh was also enthralled with night, as he wrote his brother Theo that same year. It often seems to me, does this remind you of something? Have you heard this before? He says, it often seems to me that the night is much more alive and richly colored than the day. The problem of painting night scenes and effects on the spot and actually by night interests me enormously. And he wrote that in 1888. He didn't write that in the year that he didn't write that in the year that he painted Starry Night. He wrote it several months before. This is why I say it was very much in his mind. Van Gogh's visionary landscape, The Starry Night, has long ranked as the most popular painting at New York City's Museum of Modern Art. This inspired the museum to mount the exhibition Van Gogh and the Colors of the Night through January 5, 2009. Of course, that's where I've seen the and Stephanie 1 and 2, and I'm sure many others of you, I think Chelsea as well, have also seen the Starry Night firsthand for real in Manhattan at the Museum of Modern Art. And it really is pretty incredible to think about this artist down on his luck, being kicked out of his home, hasn't sold any art at this point even. Has he? Has anyone bought any of his paintings? The Red Vineyard may have been purchased. I'm not quite sure about that. Anyone know when the Red Vineyard was purchased? Let's just check. When did Van Gogh sell the Red Vineyard? March 1890. March 1890. Did you know? Do you guys know that? It sold for £16, 400 francs, 4 months before he died. Another thing that I mentioned to my brother is, can you imagine if Van Gogh didn't have any kind of color transformation and he painted Starry Night with a palette that he used for the Potato Eaters? In other words, can you imagine him painting with the colors of snot and dirt and poo, Starry Night? Can you imagine that? So yeah, can you believe it? He sells a painting for the first time in 1890, and shouldn't that be a cause for hope for him, right? So you can imagine when he's in the asylum, one of the thoughts that must be going through his mind is, am I not just fooling myself? I haven't sold a single painting in my life and I'm an artist. Who am I trying to fool here? That's why I say, the best time for him, if he was disposed in that way to take his own life, would have been in the asylum period. He wasn't there just for a few weeks. He was there for a year in horrible conditions. It was cold. It was lonely. It was traumatic in terms of people screaming. He didn't really belong there. It seemed, if you think that he was mentally ill and he was with other mad people, actually, no, he was far more sane and functional than what they were. And, it's not like he just went there, got into bed, curled up, and just lay there for a couple of months. He was fighting the entropy of his own life. He was fighting people that kicked him out of his house, kicked him out of his town. And I think what really made it horrible was, at the time that he's not going forwards, at the time that he's basically going backwards, all his friends are going forwards. His brother's gotten married. His other brother, Cor, I think, went to South Africa. Gauguin is doing his thing, and he's basically in the hospital trying to pick up the pieces. And that's when he paints Starry Night. He doesn't paint a self-pitying little tree. He paints the spectacular fireworks display in the night, which is in a way how it's an allegory for his own thought process. Yep, I do know about it. Yes, he is resilient. So anyway, let's go back to this article. They say here, the Van Gogh we usually think of, that painter of the most audacious, crazy, passionate, frenzied, unleashed bursts of brushwork, may be evident in his daylight paintings. But in paintings such as the Arles Cafe at night, his touch is more restrained and you rarely see his intelligence at work. In other words, they're saying it's his paintings that are done at night that are really scintillating, and in terms of this artist's intelligence. Despite all the mental anguish, Van Gogh never ceased to enjoy an astonishingly clear self-awareness and consciousness of what he was doing. And this is why you kind of get a sense that in his paintings of the night, there's a dream quality to them which somehow makes them clearer than his paintings in the day, which are simply what he sees in front of him. In other words, what he's seeing at night seems more imagined in a certain sense, if you follow my meaning, than what he's seeing in the day. In other words, he's letting in the psychology of dreaming into this expressionistic um, um, art style, right? Then, contrary to an enduring misconception of Van Gogh as a rough and ready chromomaniac driven by his instincts to render what he saw almost as quickly as he saw it, the artist's twilight and night scenes are actually elaborate constructions that also call on his vast literary knowledge. Um, Van Gogh himself hinted at this in a letter to his sister written in 1888 as he was painting his first Starry Night canvas. He was inspired, he said, by imagery in the poems by Walt Whitman he was reading, and that's an American poet, right? He sees under the great starlit vault of heaven a something which, after all, one can only call God, an eternity in its place above the world. I don't know, that is such a beautiful sentiment. It actually almost reduces me to tears. Just read those words aloud yourselves. It seems that Van Gogh never dreamed his paintings would become such fixed stars in the art firmament. In 1890, less than 2 months before he ended his life with a pistol, he wrote to a Paris newspaper critic, "It is absolutely certain that I shall never do important things." In his last letter to Theo, right? His last letter to Theo, he said, "While my own work, I'm risking my life for it, and my reason is half founded because of it." So I'm not going to read the whole article, but it says, just as he received a new mastery over brush and pigment, and I mean, that was the note that we ended off Van Gogh letters. He was really finding himself. Do you remember him saying, "I'm a little bit worried if Gauguin joins me here. I don't want him to influence me because I know what I'm doing. I've found my voice." Right? Do you remember him saying that? I've discovered something and I want to kind of hold on to it. That's really an important thing to think about. Just as he achieved this mastery, he kind of lost control over his life, meaning he couldn't live where he wanted to, he couldn't live how he wanted to, and he, and I must say, I've been in that situation for quite a long period as well. Fortunately, not lately, but where you don't have a lot of money, and when you can't afford something, you have to leave, and then you've got to the whole thing of going somewhere else and setting up again takes time, and it disrupts all of that momentum that you built up. It says here, in a fit of hallucinations and anguish in December 1888, he severed part of his ear and delivered it to a prostitute at a local brothel. Now, I agree with a lot of that sentence. I think there was a fit of hallucinations. I think there was anguish. I think it did happen in December 1888, but I don't think he severed it. Someone else could also have been having hallucinations at that time. But the interesting thing is, it does involve a woman. The ear is delivered to a woman at a local brothel. So do you think Van Gogh was really so worried about Theo's fiancée as this art expert Martin Bailey thinks? Or was he worried about a prostitute that liked Gauguin more than liked him or something? Gauguin, who had come to Arles to paint with him, fled to Paris, and Van Gogh, after his neighbors petitioned the police, was locked up in a hospital. From then on, the fits recurred unpredictably. Now, it's easy to imagine that what's happening here is he's losing his mind, and that's the cause of everything. It's not so easy to imagine that he's already got syphilis and stress and poor eating and not having a lot of money, and also losing all this amount of blood in, was a near death experience for him. That could have aggravated the syphilis that he already had. He talks about a sickness that he has, and we know that Gauguin also had syphilis. Then he wrote to Theo from Saint-Remy in September 1889. We're jumping a little bit ahead here. Life passes like this. Time does not return, but I'm dead set on my work for just this very reason, that I know the opportunities of working do not return, especially in my case, blah, blah, blah. So he says, I'm dead set on my work. That is what he's dreaming about. He's dreaming about painting. He's dreaming about paintings. Okay, so I'm not going to go on with that. I think there's just one thing I wanted to add with regard to dreaming. Okay, Tim, I'm going to put you down. Let's bring myself back into frame. So we are going to go back to Van Gogh letters. I want to share just something with you that's very, I think, affirming, and maybe it'll be inspiring and a positive message for you guys. I hope so. Out of the blue, I was just right. It was, I think, during my drives to the doctor to have my lungs checked. I heard a song on the radio, and it was more that the tune of it. It was, and I just caught one or two words here and then, and I made a mental note to Google. The Afrikaans is droomsymptoom, which means dream symptom, right? And it's difficult to explain this to you, because if you can't understand Afrikaans, then you're not going to know any of these words. But the translated lyrics of this song is basically, I'm suffering from mama. I'm starting to believe in my dreams. I'm suffering from dream symptoms, meaning, and it's sung by two pretty young guys. One guy is still in high school, as far as I know. So very young kids, but they have literally had the dream of being successful musicians, right? And now this song is about, wow, I'm actually starting to believe in my dreams. And if you think about it, it's almost an inversion of the way we tend to think about dreams, where we tend to think everybody must believe in their dreams, and then who knows what happens. this is about two kids who almost so jaded and almost used to the idea that dreams don't come true. And then they say, oh crap, I'm actually starting to believe in my dreams. How's this happening? And you kind of get the same idea that this kind of feeling overtakes Van Gogh at a certain point, right? Where he has this huge setback with his art, but then he continues painting. And then somewhere along the line, especially when he's in Auvers-sur-Oise, he suddenly just gets fully consumed by that addiction and the inspiration, and he becomes um, someone that the young Van Gogh would have been really proud of. He becomes this true artist, this artist that only paints for art's sake, this artist that is truly inspired by the landscape around him, and doesn't really care what other people think about it or him. Is truly free. And then, of course, disaster strikes. So I'll come back to talking a little bit about that song. Um, the amazing thing. Let me just see if I can show you. I don't want to play it. In this song, if I just do that, in this song you see two young kids, and this is actually these musicians as youngsters, and their mother actually provided this footage of them as kids, and basically what they are like young Van Goghs in a way, but obviously in terms of the music thing, and it's just very touching how they talk about and show themselves dreaming about this idea of being musicians, and then you see that they have obviously achieved success. It may not look like much. They've only got 9,000 subscribers on YouTube. This video only got 82,000 views, but this one, I'm also not going to play it. Interestingly, it's all about sunflowers, and Van Gogh was into sunflowers. This one's got 1.9 million views. And hey Sonneblom is another way of saying hey sunflower, right? And I'm just saying, I don't know if you guys will appreciate this because you can't understand what the words say, but you might enjoy just the sound, the what's the word, the positive sound that maybe comes through if you listen to it. Anyway, the name of this band is actually Droom Syndrome, which means dream syndrome, like they've got a disorder, and their disorder is that they dreamers, right? But I thought that was quite a nice touch to think about. Why is it so important to dream? And in the true crime space, we often talk about the negative side of dreaming, where you lose touch with reality, where you get caught up in a fairy tale. And that obviously is the dark side of dreaming, where you're very naive and you know, flirting with things that aren't going to come true, right? And so you've got to be careful if your life is veering in that direction. But equally, a dream can rescue you from catastrophe. Like if there's been too much reality in your life, then maybe what you need is a little bit of fiction. Maybe what you need is a little bit of music. Maybe what you need is a little bit of um, a dream, right? Okay, let's go back to this letter. This letter. Are you guys finding this episode enriching? I hope you are. Okay, so this letter is from 17th January. My dear Theo, thanks for your kind letter and also for the 50 franc note it contained. Even though you yourself may be able to answer all the questions, I do not feel capable of it. So he's saying, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. I've got questions about our current circumstances. And he's saying, I'm trying to find some solution. Then he says, before discussing what I might spend or not spend, it might help us to go into the expenses of the current month alone. It has been altogether lamentable in every way. This sounds like things aren't going very well. He sounds far less positive in this letter, doesn't he? I should count myself lucky if at last you would give some serious attention to the way things are now and have been for a long time. But what is to be done? It is unfortunately complicated by lots of things. My pictures are valueless. They cost me. It is true, an extraordinary amount, even in blood and brains at times, perhaps. And so this is unusual. This is Van Gogh being a little bit stroppy, being a little bit, he's in a not a really great mood. Then he says, meanwhile, let's get back to the present month and not talk of anything but money. So let's just talk about money. On December 23rd, I still had in hand 1 louis and 3 sous. The same day I received from you the 100 franc note. That's a reference to, that's the day that he lost his ear, right? And so what does that tell you? On the one hand, he was completely running out of money. On the other hand, he got a big bonus, Christmas bonus, if you will. And didn't he blow that on women and alcohol? I mean, 100 francs at that point is quite a lot of money. And you could have had a situation where there was a lot of tension with Gauguin, where Gauguin said, "Hey, it's Christmas, it's cold, let's go and get a woman." And Van Gogh said, "Sorry, I don't have any money." And Gauguin, the spoiled fellow, may have gotten really irritated. Like, how can you not have any money? You invited me here, and so must we just sit here? And do you have any food in the house, kind of thing? And Van Gogh's got to play a host to Gauguin, but then later on that same day he gets 100 francs, and don't they blow that on because it's the 23rd, because of this news of the, and I'm assuming because of this news of the engagement, because Christmas is around the corner, because it's winter, they go out and they go and womanize and they drink, and it's within that scenario that something terrible takes place. Anyway, he says these are the expenses. He's got to pay the charwoman 20 francs. Same for the first fortnight, 10 francs. Paid to the hospital, 21 francs. Paid to the attendants who dressed the wound, 10 francs. On my return, paid for a table, a gas heater, in which I'd taken on account 20 francs. Paid for having all the bedding washed, 12 francs 50. Various purchases like a dozen brushes, and let's say 10 francs. So on the day or the day after I came out of hospital, we have already arrived at a forced expenditure on my part of that. Now, the question is, this money that he got, could he not have spent that on this, or did he spend it on something else? Because it came to about 100 francs. Anyway, it says, in short, the result of all this was that by the 8th I was broke. But a day or two later, I borrowed 5 francs. That barely takes us to the 10th. I hope for a letter from you about the 10th, but this letter did not arrive. So can you see, here he is concerned about money very directly. He doesn't say that when he congratulates his brother about the engagement. The time between us has been a most rigorous fast, the more painful because I cannot recover under such conditions. I've nevertheless started work again, and I have already 3 studies in the studio, besides the portrait of Dr. Ray, which I gave him as a keepsake. So there's no worse harm done this time than a little more suffering and its attendant wretchedness. So as bad as things are, he's saying, you know what, this is just a little bit of suffering that I've got to go through. And there he says, and I keep on hoping, but I feel weak and rather uneasy and frightened. That will pass, I hope, as I get back my strength. And so his mental state is actually, I think, very appropriate. He's feeling hopeful. He's relying on his strength coming back, but he's also feeling a little uneasy because he's feeling quite weak. And I mean, he's lost a lot of blood. And probably the thing that he's not aware of is the syphilis. Bear in mind, the syphilis was there before. He's been womanizing with Gauguin, which he didn't do before Gauguin got there, which has probably made it worse. And once he goes into the asylum, the syphilis will abate because he won't be drinking, he'll get enough sleep, and he'll be in a bit of a stable place. But the syphilis is actually at quite an advanced stage right here. Syphilis is a bacterial infection that if you rest, it can be beaten, it can go away. And if you have a good diet, it can go away, it can be managed. But by the same token, if you don't get enough sleep, if you have a poor diet, if you're drinking a lot, if you're engaging in unhealthy activities, including sex with prostitutes, well, then the syphilis is going to become a big deal. Ray told me that being very impressionable was enough to account for the attack that I had, and that I was really only anemic, but that I really must feed myself up. Now, you must also remember Van Gogh was quite vulnerable to getting ill at this point. He'd worked himself to the bone. Do you remember? He'd worked himself to the bone preparing the house. It worked himself to the point of exhaustion, preparing this entire house. We painted it inside and outside. He painted decorations for Gauguin. And he was also getting mentally exhausted by Gauguin just never pitching up, right? And then he does pitch up, and then they have arguments which further undermine Van Gogh's immunity, right? And the other thing that's taking place is it's winter. I don't think it's any coincidence that Van Gogh has this setback in the middle of winter. That seems to be, if you go through all his letters and all the disasters, all of his worst health crises seem to take place in the middle of winter, and he says so himself. He says that he struggles in the winter. And look where we are now, in January. He says, if by pure chance or misunderstanding it had just happened that I'd had to keep a strict fast for a week, whether he had seen many madmen in similar circumstances fairly quite unable to work. If not, would he then be good enough to remember occasionally that for a moment I am not yet mad, that for the that is his own diagnosis. For the moment, I am not yet mad. Why is this? He says, okay, let's just get rid of that. I'm trying to just copy this. I don't quite know what the issue is. Anyway, let me just type it out. That's quite a self-assessment. For the moment, I am not yet mad. That's Van Gogh speaking for himself after the ear incident. Now, considering that all the house was upset by this occurrence and all the linen and my clothes soiled, is there anything improper or extravagant or exorbitant in these payments? If I paid what was owing to people almost as poor as myself. So the other thing that's taking place right now is, besides a massive health setback, he's also got a massive financial setback, right? Now today on the 17th, I had last received 50 francs. Out of that, I'm paying first the 5 francs borrowed from the patron at the cafe and the 10 meals taken on credit during the course of last week, which makes 750. So the 100 francs he got, I don't think he spent on this. Look at this: borrowed from the patron at the cafe and 10 meals taken on credit. What does he mention over here? On my return, paid for a table. Okay, anyway. I also have to pay for the linen brought back from the hospital and then for this last week for shoe repairs. So this is one big moan. This letter is one big moan about the money that he needs. But how can I put it? Do you think that do you think the explanation makes sense that Theo tells him he's getting engaged, and then Van Gogh cuts off his ear and then asks him for money anyway? Does that really make sense? It's the same as when Theo said that he was having a child, and the next thing Van Gogh said, well, I'm a little bit concerned, and then he made a really huge order for paints. Was he really that concerned about it? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So anyway, he says, there, my dear boy, are the accounts for this present month. It is not over. Now we come to the expenses caused you by Gauguin's telegram, which I've already expressly reproached him for sending. So he's the biggest gripe Van Gogh has got with Gauguin isn't so much whether Gauguin cut off his ear or not, or whether Gauguin left him. His biggest gripe is Gauguin causing an expense in terms of almost a texting, sending a telegram to Theo, which prompted Theo to come all the way down to Arles, and then Theo and Gauguin went back to Paris, and that was a huge expense. Are the expenses thus mistakenly incurred less than 200 francs? And this is where Van Gogh is like a really good lawyer. He says, does Gauguin himself claim that it was a brilliant step to take? Look here, I won't say more about the absurdity of this measure. Suppose that I was as wild as anything, then why wasn't our illustrious partner more collected? Right? So here he says, it's kind of an allusion with an A to the ear incident. He says, suppose that I was wild as anything. Why wasn't our illustrious partner, it's kind of sarcastic, why wasn't Gauguin more sensible? And then he says, but I'm not going to press the point. I don't know why I can't. This is a really important statement, I think. Don't you think he's being somewhat sarcastic about Gauguin? He calls him our illustrious partner. Don't you think there's a bit of contempt in that statement? He's basically saying, okay, so let's say I was going nuts, I was going crazy. Why wasn't our illustrious partner more sensible when all of this is going down? In other words, he wasted a lot of money summoning you unnecessarily. He says, but I shan't press that point. That's another thing. He's not going to make a big deal of it. He's not going to be a drama queen. I cannot commend you enough for paying Gauguin in such a way that he can only congratulate himself on any dealings he has had with us. That also, doesn't that come across as a little bit of a snipe at Gauguin? Gauguin can only be patting himself on the back for how he played us. Gauguin has come out of this with his nose ahead. Does that sound like Van Gogh is very happy with Gauguin, or possibly very unhappy with him? Like I said earlier, he doesn't talk about everything all the time. For example, he doesn't tell his doctor that he's got insomnia. Mel says, I think he's being very sarcastic. I also do. Unfortunately, there's another. So he's basically emotionally blackmailing his brother. He's saying, "Thanks so much, Theo. You know, you gave Gauguin a lot of money, and he's probably really okay. But Gauguin um, incurred those expenses recklessly, whereas my expenses were not incurred. It wasn't my fault." Now, why would he say that if he cut off his own ear? If he cut off his own ear, it would be his fault. So why is he saying, where does he say it? Where does he say it? He says, did I do wrong? I'm just trying to see where it mentions it. Just trying to look at where he talks about. He talks about forced expenditure, and he says, is there anything improper or extravagant or exorbitant in these payments? He's basically saying that it's not his fault that these payments happened. Now, if he cut off his own ear, then surely it is his fault. Do you follow my thinking? So he compares his forced payments to Gauguin's telegram, which he says was totally unnecessary. Can you see that's kind of his legalistic reasoning? Don't you think that's quite a good argument for Van Gogh touching on the likelihood that Gauguin was at fault here in an indirect way? Then he says, must he not, or at least should he not begin to see that we were not exploiting him, but on the contrary, were anxious to secure him a living, the possibility of work and of decency? That does not obtain the heights of the grandiose prospectuses for the Association of Artists which he proposed. Then why not consider him as not responsible for the trouble and waste which his blindness may have caused both you and me? That is coming very close to accusing him of being responsible for it. He says, why consider him as not responsible for the trouble and waste which his blindness may have caused both you and me? And when he talks about blindness, maybe he's talking about a guy who doesn't think about finances, but he may also be talking about a guy who kind of goes blind when he gets angry. And we know that Gauguin got into fist fights with some of the locals, right? He has had experience in what he calls banking in Paris and thinks himself clever at it. Again, he doesn't sound very fond of Gauguin here. Perhaps you and I are not curious at all in this respect. In any case, by the way, um, Gauguin was a banker. I think he traded in shares or something, or he was in some kind of banking profession, but I think he left in disgrace. And Van Gogh seems to think of him almost as a fraudster. Anyway, he says, in this case, it is not altogether in contradiction with some passages in our previous correspondence. If Gauguin stayed in Paris for a while to examine himself thoroughly, or have himself examined by a specialist, I don't honestly know what the result might be. Again, it doesn't seem to be too complimentary to Gauguin here, does he? He seems quite resentful. He seems quite angry. On various occasions, I've seen him do things which you and I would not let ourselves do because we have consciences that feel differently about things. I've heard one or two things said of him, but having seen him at very, very close quarters, I think that he is carried away by his imagination, perhaps by pride, but practically irresponsible. Now, if you think that Gauguin did cut off Van Gogh's ear and then skedaddled out of, oh, what could be more irresponsible than that? This conclusion does not imply that I advise you to pay very much attention to what he says on any occasion. But I see that you have acted with higher ideals in the matter of settling his bill. So I think that we need not fear that he will involve us in the errors of the Bank of Paris. You can see that he's writing in a fairly oblique, symbolic way, right? But as for him, Lord, let him do anything he wants. Let him have his independence, whatever he means by that. Doesn't it make you think that he said to Van Gogh, I want to be independent. I want to leave all. And Van Gogh took that personally, and Van Gogh got quite emotional, and that led to a big argument. Again, it's still a very unusual side to Van Gogh, who seems to be somewhat embittered now that the financial how do they call it? The rooster has come back to roost or something. I think it is rather strange that he claims a picture of sunflowers from me, right? And so there's also complaining about Gauguin basically stealing one of his artworks, something that he can kind of use as a bribe or as blackmail. He says, offering me in exchange, I suppose, or as a gift, some studies he left here. I'll send him back his studies, which will probably be useful to him, which they certainly won't be to me. But for the moment, I'm keeping my canvases here, and I'm definitely keeping my sunflowers in question. He has two of them already. Let that hold him. If he's not satisfied with the exchange he's made with me, he can take back his little Martinique canvas. I guess that's this one. By the way, I read an article about Gauguin where he apparently often painted a little cat, a black cat, in his paintings. We'll maybe deal with that in episode 73. And his self-portrait sent me from Brittany. That's that one. Doesn't he look like a bit of a shyster? Doesn't he look like a bit of a scallywag? Apparently he was more good looking than what Van Gogh was. At the same time giving me back my portrait. Suppose you could say the same with Van Gogh. Doesn't he look like a bit of a scallywag? Well, the locals thought so. So an unusual picture of Van Gogh where his hair is very short. So if he ever broaches the subject again, I've told you how matters stand. How can Gauguin pretend that he was afraid of upsetting me by his presence when he can hardly deny that he knew I kept asking for him continually and that he was told over and over again that I insisted on seeing him at once? So yeah, you kind of really get a sense of Van Gogh being anguished about the way Gauguin treated him. And he's basically accusing Gauguin of lying, that he said, well, he was afraid that if Van Gogh saw him, it might upset him into cutting off his other ear, you know. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Thank you. Just to tell him that we should keep it between him and me without upsetting you, he would not listen. That also seems to be a very loaded sentence. Keep what between him and me? Now, if Van Gogh had cut off his own ear, why was it necessary for Gauguin to contact Theo? Whereas if Gauguin had cut off Van Gogh's ear, he might want to say to Theo, I can't handle your brother. He drove me to do it. Or maybe he said, I insist that your brother cut off his own ear. Anyway, he says, it worries me to go over all this and recapitulate such things over and over again. In this letter, I've tried to show you the difference between my net expenses, directly my own, and those for which I'm less responsible. And I don't know, like, am I crazy when I say, you know, when Van Gogh says some expenses are my own, but some I'm not really responsible for, isn't he indirectly saying Gauguin is responsible for that? And I mean, a lot of these expenses are for bloody linen that needs to be cleaned and things like that. Do you guys agree? I'm not sure if I saw this when I wrote the book. I'm not sure if I made this, drew this conclusion when I wrote the book in terms of the finances. Okay, so then he says, I've been miserable because just at this moment you have had this expense, which did no one any good. So he's clearly upset that he's a burden to his brother when his brother's just gotten engaged. And now, if that was the reason, why doesn't he cut off his other ear? If that was the original reason. He's miserable after the fact. He wasn't miserable before the fact. And yet, once again, you've got an art expert basically saying, I know why I cut off his ear, because this would have been something that bothered him. I think it did bother him, or I think it did register. But this is someone I think that just doesn't understand who Van Gogh is or how he thinks. It's someone who just doesn't know the identity, the person that Van Gogh is, even though he's written all these books about him. Whatever happens, I shall see my strength come back little by little if I can stick it out here. I do so dread a change or move just because of the fresh expense. I've been unable to get a breathing spell for a long time now. I'm not giving up work because there are moments when it is really getting on, and I believe that with patience, the goal will at last be reached, that the pictures will pay back the money invested in them. Right? So that's in a way the dream he has, which is that the huge amount of money that Theo has spent on him, he'll be able to start paying back. Obviously, he never does. Roulon is about to leave as early as the 21st. He is to be employed in Marseille. The increase in pay is microscopic, and he will, it's quite a funny word, tiny increase in pay, and he will be obliged to leave his wife and children for a time. They will not be able to follow him till much later because the expenses of a whole family will be heavier in Marseille. That's in a way also an allegory to his brother and additional expenses. It is a promotion for him, but it is a poor consolation that the government gives such an employee after so many years' work. And in point of fact, and so here, although he's been very emotional and griping about Gauguin, he talks about something else. He says, I believe that both he and his wife are heartbroken. Roland has often kept me company during the last week. I quite agree with you that we mustn't meddle with medical questions which do not at all concern us. Just because you wrote a line to M. Ray saying that that you would give him introductions in Paris, I understood you to mean Reveille. I did not think I was doing anything to compromise you by telling M. Ray that if he went to Paris, I'd be pleased if he took a picture to Emrave as a keepsake from me. Of course, I did not mention anything else, but what I did say was that I myself should always regret not being a doctor, that those who think painting is beautiful would do well to see nothing in it but a study of nature. So a little bit of a feeling that he wishes he was a doctor. I know at one point, it's happened once or twice, you see a lawyer at work and you wish that maybe you'd become a lawyer or a pilot. If there were two professions that I came very close to choosing, one was a lawyer and one was a pilot. Okay, then he says, it will always be a pity, in spite of everything, that Gauguin and I were perhaps too quick to give up the question of Rembrandt and light which we had broached. Are De Haan and Isaacson still there? Don't let them get discouraged. After my illness, my eyes have naturally been very sensitive. You see how he refers to it as illness? Well, it seems to me that there is a real touch of Rembrandt in that figure, which seems to be lit up by the reflection of light coming from the open tomb in front of which the croque-mort is standing like a sleepwalker. It is done with great subtlety. I myself do not try to get effects by means of charcoal, and De Haan has taken for his medium this very charcoal, again a colorless substance. I should like De Haan to see a study of mine of a lighted candle and two novels lying in an empty chair, Gauguin's chair, and that's this picture. And he painted that as a way of describing Gauguin as someone who was extravagant and just trying to think of the word. When I say rich, I don't mean literally rich. What's another word for rich? Lavish, someone who's used to a lavish lifestyle, someone who is, I guess, liberal, someone who likes to live larger than life, someone who is got a big appetite as well. And if you think of the opposite to that, well, that was Van Gogh painting a bare straw chair, very minimalist, right? In other words, this is a character who's quite self-indulgent, quite narcissistic, quite spoiled, quite refined in a certain way. You know, he's got a certain pedigree. He's quite respected, but he certainly also thinks quite a lot of himself. Were Gauguin and Van Gogh a good match as housemates? In these two studies, I have tried for an effect of light by means of clear color. Although this letter is already very long, since I've tried to analyze the month's expenses and complained a bit of the queer phenomenon. So there again is a little bit of a snipe. I'm complaining about the queer phenomenon of Gauguin's behavior in choosing not to speak to me again and clearing out. There are still some things that I must add in praise of him. And sometimes Van Gogh says things that are kind of sly understatements. I think this is one of them. He goes on to say, one good quality he has is the marvelous way he can apportion expenses from day to day. While I'm often absent-minded, preoccupied with aiming at the goal, he has far more money sense for each separate day than I have. But his weakness is that by a sudden freak or animal impulse, he upsets everything he has arranged. And I think, isn't that telling you something as well? Did Van Gogh have a sudden freak or animal impulse, or did Gauguin? What do you think? It's actually an incredible letter, this. Then he says, now, do you stay at your post once you have taken it, or do you desert it? I do not judge anyone in this, hoping not to be condemned myself in cases when my strength might fail me. But if Gauguin has so much real virtue, so that's again another snipe at Gauguin, right? It's another snipe at Gauguin. Imagine, have you ever said to behind someone's back, if X has so much real virtue, blah blah blah? That's another way of saying he's not very virtuous. And such capacity for charity, how is he going to employ himself? In other words, he's saying Gauguin is not a virtuous character. And if you think about it in total, if you think about Van Gogh in a total sense, would you say that he's a virtuous character? I mean, he doesn't do anyone any harm. He paints. He is trying to do something without any payment. Essentially, he is self-sacrificing himself for his art. He is a virtuous man, wouldn't you say? Another way of saying it is, who is more virtuous, Gauguin or Van Gogh? If Gauguin is virtuous, Van Gogh isn't. If Van Gogh is virtuous, Gauguin isn't. Which one do you think it is? Now, I do think it's a little bit oversimplistic to say Van Gogh is virtuous, because when it came to the opposite sex, he was a little bit of a mess. He was a little bit all over the place. But maybe many of us are. Then he says, as for me, I've ceased to be able to follow his actions, and I give it up in silence, but with a questioning note all the same. Again, a very telling statement. In terms of his actions, I'm giving them up in silence, but I still question his actions. From time to time, he and I have exchanged ideas about French art and Impressionism. It seems to me impossible, at least improbable, that Impressionism will organize and steady itself now. Why shouldn't what happened in England at the time of the pre-Raphaelites happen here? The Union broke up. Perhaps I take all these things too much to heart, and perhaps they sadden me too much. Has Gauguin ever read Tartarin in the Alps, and does he remember Tartarin's illustrious companion from Tarascon, who had such imagination that he imagined in a flash a complete imaginary Switzerland? Does he remember the knot in a rope found high up in the Alps after the fall? And you want to know how things happened. Have you read Tartarin all the way through? And I think that's also a little bit of a cryptic remark to his brother. And I guess if you want to know the answer, what was Tartarin's story? He says that will teach you to know your Gauguin pretty well. Again, not a particularly complimentary remark. I'm really serious in urging you to look at this passage in Daudet's book again. At the time of your visit here, were you able to notice the study I painted of the Tarasson diligence, which, as you know, is mentioned in Tartar and the Lion Hunter? Is Bria still with us? I'd be interested to know if Bria is familiar with these stories. Um, anyway, he says that is what it is, though in another way, Gauguin has a fine, free, and absolutely complete imaginary conception of the South. And with that imagination, he's going to work in the North. My word, we may see some queer results yet. Again, I'm not sure if that's a very nice, I don't think that's a compliment. And now, dissecting the situation in all boldness, there is nothing to prevent us seeing him as the little Bonaparte tiger of Impressionism, as far as, I don't quite know how to say it, his vanishing, say from Arles, would be comparable or analogous to the return from Egypt of the aforesaid little corporal. Again, he's criticizing Gauguin's strange behavior, his vanishing act from all. And he's comparing it to the story. And he talks about someone who always left the armies in the lurch. Fortunately, Gauguin and I and other painters are not yet armed with machine guns and other very destructive implements of war. I, for one, am quite decided to go on being armed with nothing but my brush and my pen. So he seems to be saying he was unarmed. And he seems to be saying in an indirect way that Gauguin was armed. But with a good deal of clatter, Gauguin has nonetheless demanded in his last letter his masks and fencing gloves, hidden in the little closet in my little yellow house. There's a little bit of another cryptic clue. He basically says, you know, it's a good thing that we aren't armed with machine guns, right? And he says, I'm only armed with a brush and a pen, but he's saying, well, Gauguin was armed with basically swords. And he says, I shall hasten to send him his toys. Again, it's a disparaging way of referring to Gauguin's possessions. Can you see that? It's just on repeat, is repeatedly. Then he also says, hoping that he will never use more serious weapons. I think I did refer to this parts of this letter, but the more pertinent parts. You know, if you say a thing like that, I hope he's not going to use more serious weapons. That sounds like you're saying he's already used less serious weapons. He is physically stronger than we are, so his passions must be much stronger than ours. Then he is a father, he has a wife and children in Denmark, and at the same time, he wants to go to the other end of the earth, to Martinique. It is frightful, all the wealth of incompatible desires and needs which this must cause them. I took the liberty of assuring him that if he had kept quiet here with us, working at Arles, without wasting money and earning, since you were looking after his pictures, his wife would certainly have written to him and would have approved of his stability. There is more besides. He had been in pain and seriously ill, and the thing was to discover the disease and the remedy. Now, here his pains have already ceased. A lot of this letter is about money, and the part that's not about money is about Gauguin. That's enough for today. If you have the address of Laval, Gauguin's friend, you can tell Laval that I'm very much surprised that his friend Gauguin did not take a portrait of myself, which I'd intended for him, away with him to be handed over. I have another new one for you too. That seems like a little bit of a slap in the face from Gauguin to Van Gogh, that Gauguin takes paintings that Vincent didn't want him to have and doesn't take paintings that he did want him to have, like that one. It's actually not a bad self-portrait. Thank you again for your letter. Please do try to realize that it'll be really impossible to live 13 days on the 23.5 francs which I've left, but I'll try and manage. With a handshake, yours, Vincent. Okay, I'm not sure why. I've actually got a bit of a headache. I really want to go through this letter. Unfortunately, it's not a very long one. So I'm going to go through this letter and then call it a day. I just want to... I just want to revisit this whole idea of why is it important to dream, right? And here are some answers. Because we need to do emotional processing. Dreams help to process emotions, memory consolidation, right? And there are really two important ways to think about this is dreaming is a kind of natural defragmentation, a decluttering, a consolidation of thoughts that are messy and chaotic, right? I'm talking about when you dream, when you sleep. But I think it's also important to remember that we can only go so far with things like introspection. We can only do so much with conscious trying to analyze things and so on. But we can never complete that process. We can never take everything and tie a nice bow around it. And so I think it's important to remember that um, we actually have psychological limits, and that it's important that the unconscious or the subconscious, um, to some extent, even in a fictional way, take some of these things that we can't make sense of and basically make sense of them even in a fictional way, so that we've got the psychological efficacy to start the next day in a somewhat effective way. Another way to think about this is that emotional clutter and emotional chaos and psychological loose ends are happening to us on a daily basis. And one way to address that is by decluttering our own environment. So, in a way that you can almost um, help your own mind deal with the cluttering effects of life is to declutter your own environment, right? And that as a way of almost symbolically dealing with um, a lot of fragments that are useless to your daily life, not meaningful, not helpful. And I must say, my office got really messy over the festive season, and uncharacteristically, because I don't like throwing away my notes, but uncharacteristically, I got hold of two garbage bags and I filled them with little scraps of paper, and I've also shifted a lot of um, notes and notebooks and things. And all of it was very triggering. I was finding little scraps from travels through Portugal and through France as well. Um, when you do that, you certainly are triggered by certain things in the past, and in some ways good, and in some ways not so good. But I've got to say, when that process was completed, and I was able to throw two full garbage bags of papers and litter, garbage basically away, it really felt good. It felt relieving. It felt like one was unburdening oneself. And so I think one's got to think about doing that consciously as well What are you carrying with you? Thoughts, memories of the past that aren't really serving you anymore. We're in a new year. What are you carrying with you that maybe it's time to let go? Also, is it time for a new dream? And is a new dream perhaps going to help you with some emotional processing that you need to do, right? Can you guys see what's on the screen? I don't know if it's too small. Thanks so much for that, Yvonne. Thank you so much. Pleasure. I think I've got something else just to put on screen. Let's see if I can find it. So dreams are effectively your brain's way of sorting through information, right? What did I write here? Let me just have a look. Van Gogh's commitment and investment in the Yellow House proved that he was the real deal, trying an authentic approach to art. So the dream for Van Gogh of having this yellow house, remember he was a unsuccessful artist at that point. The whole thing about having the yellow house and having the studio and having other artists come there was a little bit like me going to America. You're trying to prove that you're the real deal. You are making the effort to be there in person, and you are putting in a lot of effort, right? And he's trying to show through this that he's the real deal, that he's an authentic artist. And guess what happens? He pays a really, really heavy price for trying to do that. He pays a very, very heavy price for trying to do that. I've also written here, we dream for the same reason we think about things after they've happened. They leave an impression on us which may or may not be resolved consciously and may or may not be resolved subconsciously. And I think that's both common sense and incredibly profound. Let me say that again. We dream for the same reason we think about things after they've happened. And you may think about something after it's happened, and I might think of that and say, that's not really very important. Or I might say, I think that's incredibly important, but it may be a totally different for you. So, for example, I told you about I was walking my dog, and there was a dog walker who was finishing her walk, and then I said, "Well, just walk another lap with me," and she said no, and drove away. Not unfriendly, just that she didn't really want to. And I just really needed a little bit of companionship because that had been a particularly horrible day. And you might look at that and say, that's not a big deal, but that felt incredibly significant to me. That moment felt really significant to me. And you might have a dream about that sort of resolves it. Another thing that's significant for me is I haven't really been able to think about or deal with my friend Alex in the way that I wanted to. I haven't been able to deal with the court case. I don't really have much to do with his wife. I have nothing to do with his kids. And so there's someone who was once there and then he's suddenly just gone. And then I guess how you deal with that in a way is you have dreams. And also, to some extent, I know Alex had certain ambitions in terms of sport. You either take them on yourself in almost like a voyeuristic way, or you decide they're not meaningful. I don't know. You find some way of thinking about it. Um, the lyrics for that song, I did post a link to it on Twitter if you guys want to listen to it. But the lyrics go. Just have a look at what you guys voted here. Um, I'm really glad to see 70% got the answer right. Sometime in mid-January, only 10 votes, but it's still the majority of you got it right. Well done. What else did I write here? Okay, I'm just going to put it on the screen. You guys aren't really going to be able to. You guys aren't really going to be able to make much sense of it. Um, Let me just take it off anyway. Um, how am I going to share this with you guys? I'm just going to read a little bit of the lyrics of this song. I wonder if I can put the original here. Okay, I think before we conclude, I want to just look at this article. Sorry, I know I'm jumping around a little, but I just want to get to this before I lose it. It says here the real reason Van Gogh sliced off his ear, and it's to do with this book by Martin Bailey, right? And let's just have a look at what it says. It was the night before Christmas, a cold Sunday evening in the French city of Arles, when Vincent van Gogh took the razor he kept on his small dressing table and slashed off his left earlobe. I don't know if it was okay. The night before Christmas Eve was the 23rd. Okay, so that's right. Why? Nobody knows. Some of the more popular theories include madness. No, I don't think so. Drinking problems. I think that's part of it. A gory fight with artist Paul Gauguin. What about drinking problems and a gory fight with the artist? And I don't know where this comes from. A desire to be coddled by his mother. More than 100 years later, it is still the most debated event in the famed Dutch artist's life. And then we have Martin Bailey's book introduced, and he says it was the fear. Um, a new book suggests another likely motive. He heard wedding bells. He heard wedding bells. That's why he cut off his ear, because he heard wedding bells. Right? Do you believe that? Van Gogh cut off his ear because he heard wedding bells. And so this is the story. Van Gogh suffered a breakdown, cut off his ear after he got a letter from his brother saying he was getting married. And that's according to art expert Martin Bailey. Do you agree with that? Hi, Vincent, I'm getting married. Oh no, damn, my brother's going to get married. I need to cut off my ear. I can't bear the thought that my brother's getting married. And so he says it was fear that pulled the trigger and led to the breakdown. Fear of being abandoned in both an emotional and financial way. That's art experts' theory. And then they say some historians have dismissed this theory. They assume Van Gogh learned of his brother's engagement long after the ear episode. Um, I think it's possible that he did learn of the ear episode. Sorry, he did learn of the engagement on the 23rd because he got a letter. That letter's disappeared, and I think that's when he got the 100 francs. You would imagine that that Theo would have mentioned it. Um, Van Gogh was likely despairing that Theo's marriage would harm their close relationship and that the pressures of supporting a growing family would leave Theo less money. Then it says the Van Gogh story everyone wants to hear. Um, anyway, and he says the wedding was the only trigger. Wedding was only the trigger, and then was not the sole catalyst. Wedding was only the trigger, and then here was not was wedding was only the trigger. Okay. Well, the only thing that they don't mention here is what about Gauguin? So he cut off his ear to silence the voices in his head, I guess. Anyway, so that's the difference between an art expert and someone who has been around the block a couple of times in true crime and has also written more than a dozen articles on artists and knows a little bit about identity, I'd say. And I think you guys do too, right? Can you see how you've got an expert saying something that kind of makes sense, but there's a better explanation, in my opinion. Do you guys agree? The right answer on the poll was um, the 9th of January, I think. Or you're talking about the poll on YouTube right now? Just have a look. What is the poll on YouTube? I can't quite see it here. I can't quite see it here. Do you think Van Gogh took the news of Theo's engagement positively or negatively? Is that what you're asking? I would say that he took it positively. Um, I would say that he took it positively, and the least of you voted on that. I don't think it's negatively. I don't really think he had mixed feelings. I think he did take it positively. He did have bigger issues like Gauguin. That's also somewhat true. See, most of you say he had mixed feelings. I don't know. I guess I have a higher opinion of Van Gogh than most of you do. Robbie Robin said, "Ooh, that's what I said." Robbie Robin, did you say took it positively? Okay, I think we're gonna just end off for this last letter. It's quite a long live. I didn't think it would be this long. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning here. I don't want to mess up my sleep cycle. This letter was written on my birthday, 19 January, 1889. Before I was a little piece of stardust floating around somewhere. My dear Thea, I must write you a line again today. Yesterday, they again presented the gas bill for 10 francs, which I also paid. That again increases the account which I made out for you in my last letter. So money, 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 right? And reduces what is left of the 50 franc note for my food to very little. If you could send me something more, I've explained it all clearly enough. Nowhere does he say in his letters, I'm sorry to be a burden to me. How's your fiance? Are you able to cope? He just doesn't mention it. Then he says, I'm still very weak and I shall have difficulty in getting my strength back if the cold continues. There is a reference to how the cold is a yearly issue for him. Ray will give me quinine wine, which will have the right effect, I think. I still have a lot to tell you in reply to your letter, but I have a picture on the easel and am in a hurry. You didn't tell me that Andre B had been married before. That's Joe's brother. Joe sent me a note in reply to my congratulation. It is very kind of her. It always seemed to me that you owed it to your social position and to the position you have in the family to get married. And besides, for a number of years, it has been our mother's wish too. That's the first time he's really expanded on the fact that his brother's getting married. It's the first time he's really dealing with it. And look at the date. It's the 19th of January. It's easily 3 weeks later. And you don't get the sense that it's a burden to him. You don't get the sense that it's tough for him to talk about. You also don't kind of get the sense that he compares himself to his brother, like, oh, you're getting married. What do people say about me? Right? You don't kind of get that impression. He says, and thus by doing what you ought to do, you'll perhaps have more peace even amidst 1,001 difficulties than before. All the same, life is not easy for me either. What wouldn't I have given to be able to spend a day here with you and show you the work in progress? So, his big regret is that Theo came all the way down to see freaking Gauguin when he could have seen his brother himself when he was conscious and healthy, and they could have gone for a walk in the field, and he could have shown Theo where all of his money's gone, and kind of just gotten a sense of solidarity with his brother. Now I should have preferred your seeing nothing of what I have here to having carried away an impression of it under such distressing conditions. That's that. What is Gulamin doing? You know he has a son now. Bernard is more and more bothered by his father. Remember, Bernard's father was disapproving of Gauguin. That house is becoming more and more of a hell. And the worst of it is there's not much one can do. If you put your head into it and you put it into a regular viper's nest, they, Gauguin and Bernard, are now going to try to get Bernard exempted from service on account of a narrowness of the chest. All right, but it would be 1,000 times better for him to do his service decently in Algiers with Méliès. Méliès will be starting to think me a fool, for he keeps on asking me for news of him. Roulon is on the point of leaving. His pay here was 135 francs a month to bring up 3 children on that and live on it himself and his wife. You can imagine what it has been, and that's not all. The increase is a remedy worse than the disease itself. What a government, what a time we are living in. Well, doesn't it seem like that for us? What a government, what a time we're living in. As for me, I've rarely seen a man of Rouland's temperament. There is something in him tremendously like Socrates, ugly as a satyr, as Michelet called him, until on the last day a god appeared in him that illuminated the Parthenon. If Chatrian, whom you met, had seen that man, write me at once, please, for what you've sent was not really enough, as I've tried to explain to you with the utmost clearness. Ever yours, Vincent, and then quite a long postscript. I forgot to mention that yesterday I had a letter from Gauguin again about the masks and fencing gloves. Another letter from Gauguin saying, send me my freaking weapons back. Can you believe it? I asked you for my weapons, send them back, please. Full of diverse and diversified projects, and he already sees the end of his journey on the horizon, naturally. He's already afraid of not being able to go to Brussels for that reason. And after that, if he cannot even go to Brussels, how is he to go to Denmark and the tropics? The best thing he could do, and the very thing he will not do, would be quite simply to return here. But we have not got to that yet, for he does not say that he sees bankruptcy on the horizon, though it is more than visible between the lines. He's still temporarily at the Schuffeneckers. Can you see he did go back to to Bernard and his sister. That's the impression I get, because that was where he was when he left. And maybe it was Theo's engagement that made him think, well, Theo is getting his happily ever after with a woman, I want mine as well. And maybe Gauguin got some letter from Bernard's sister saying, I miss you, it's Christmas, I wish you were here for New Year. That's often when people want to be together. He says, I have not answered him. Fortunately, one thing is certain. I dare say that basically Gauguin are by nature fond of each other, to be able to begin again together if necessary. But he says, I have not answered him. Gauguin has asked him for his, what do you call it? Masks and fencing gloves, and obviously his swords. And he says, I've not answered him. He says, I'm very pleased that you have not forgotten the anatomy lesson. In the future, I shall always need a doctor from time to time. And just because he knows me well now, it would be another reason for me to stay quietly here. I will write to you again soon, but as for the month's money, draw your own conclusions. My net expenditure will not be more than any other month. And so that's that. We'll do the next letters in the next episode, and that's where he writes to Gauguin on the 22nd or 23rd January. Just to note that he says something about weapons of war, I think. Where does he say it? I shall send you your things. In a few days' time, I'll pluck up the courage. As for the fencing masks and gloves, these terrible engines of war will just have to wait until then, right? It's quite a big statement to make. Terrible engines of war. It's not just fencing masks and gloves. It's also the swords, right? Anyway, we'll deal with that letter completely in the next analysis. So yeah, that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed episode 72. And we're trying to see how he gets from this place of being wounded and broken and disgraced and sickened and harmed and weakened to Starry Night. How does that happen? And it's definitely going to be up and down. He's going to have good days and horrible days. He's going to be forced out of the town that he's in. So it's going to be quite an adventure, quite a lot of trauma. It's pretty much a downward spiral, but also something amazing that comes out of that incredible period of adversity. And I think there's a little bit of a lesson in that adversity in some ways can be a gift if we apply it in the right way, if we dream the right dreams when those adversities assault us. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for being here, class of around about 40. Thanks for being here. Robbie Robbins says it's been amazing. Bria, I'm glad that you've been here throughout. Songbird says, I love the language of the letters, a lost start. It is amazing how eloquent he is, how well read he is, how well spoken he is. You know, he could have been a journalist. He could have been a writer. Thanks a lot, Mel. Thanks, Chelsea. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Robbie Robin. What does Kimchi say? Fascinating. I think this is your first Van Gogh letters, am I right? So I'm glad you enjoyed it. So I don't know when I'm going to do this again, but it'll likely be next Saturday. If the mood strikes me, maybe tomorrow, but more than likely I'll be doing it once a week, to try and get a little bit of parity between the time he's writing about and the time we are in terms of this year. So by next week, we'll probably be in the same February time period as he is. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. Michelle P says smiley face. Okay. Thanks a lot, guys. Mickey says enjoyed. Okay. The picture behind me is a picture I took, by the way. I think it's in MoMA. I could be wrong. I think it's in MoMA. And I think it was with Stephanie, wasn't it? Stephanie H. Stephanie, do you remember this picture? Thanks a lot, Wendy. So tomorrow I'm going to be putting up an interesting analysis on Jennifer Doulos. I think one's got to go way beyond the court case and think about this as a narrative and a symbolic narrative as well. And that's what I've done. And it does make it a lot more powerful and a lot more personal. That's what I thought. Cool. Yvonne says, where's my straw hat? I actually loaned it to a friend, but I think it's downstairs. I think it is downstairs. Cool. Okay, so that's it from me. Thanks a lot for the super chats, and really good to have you guys back. It would have been a little bit grim if there were just 5 or 10 in this little class, but the sort of 30 to 40 is about the number that we expect. So good to see you guys here. By the way, the peach tree outside is about as tall as it's going to get. It's really flourished. And there'll probably be a lot more peaches next year. I planted an apple tree where the other peach tree was, and that tree is really doing very well. Leaves all over the place. It just needs to grow a little bit in the remaining months of this summer. So let's see what happens. I don't know whether the apple tree is suited because it gets pretty hot here, but I guess time will tell. Okay, yeah. Good to hear. Good to hear. So when I say sweet dreams, I really do hope that you sleep in a way that you're able to dream and help yourself deal with your days, not just tonight, but every night. It's important to have to make time for sleep so that you can dream, so that there can be that consolidation, that there can be that emotional resolution, so that your next day you can wake up and start effectively. I also want to encourage you to think about dreaming in a way that you perhaps haven't thought about it before. I'm talking about a dream for this year or a dream for the next couple of years. What is it you want to do? What is it you want to achieve? What is it you want that is different to what you already have? And just want to encourage you to think about that. I also want you to encourage you that if you're feeling bogged down by stress, adversity, it can be a tremendous gift. It can be a tremendous blessing. And try and think about it in that sense, that through this you may actually come out with some very meaningful experience. Mickey says, I had no luck with apple trees in Texas. Well, I'll let you know what happens with this one. Okay, guys, keep weaving, and I'll see you guys next time. I'm going to play out with this. Ciao.
I am haunted by waters.